The fire catches quick, a crackle, a hiss, and then a roar. The ship, soaked in resin and dreams of the afterlife, ignites against the deep blue of a Nordic fjord. Shadows of antlered helmets and tear-lined faces flicker in the glow. Tonight, a warrior is going home, and the gods are watching. Not every Viking was granted such a send-off. Only the great, the feared, the revered, those whose sagas were sung long after their bones turned to ash. But those flames did more than honor the dead. They revealed the raw heart of a people who believed that death was a voyage, not an end. There's a whisper in the cold mist, the kind that makes the hairs rise behind the ear. A presence felt when watching something ancient unfold, something half-remembered by the blood. Not the brain-dotted begins here. One death, one funeral, but not a simple burial. This was a performance, a sacrifice, a declaration. And it started with fire. The man was no ordinary farmer or fisherman. He had once sailed to foreign shores, led raids through fog-soaked rivers, and returned with silver, wounds, and songs written in other men's terror. Now, his body lay on a linen-covered board, surrounded by wooden figures carved in fierce scowls. Around him, the village moved like a tide, grief, respect, and a strange energy simmering beneath the surface. This was more than mourning. This was preparation. For 9 days the body would lie in state while the community gathered. Not all who came were friends. Some were rivals. Some came only to watch. But all eyes now turned toward the longship anchored at the edge of the inlet, silent, patient, like a beast waiting to be fed. Drums began to thump, low, steady. The kind of beat that seems to rise from the ground and thud through the ribs. Every beat marked time, not just for the living, but for the soul's journey beyond Dot. It wasn't enough to burn a body. No, the journey to Valhalla demanded symbols, proof of worth, weapons, armor, even the bones of faithful animals. The chieftain's sword, notched and blackened, was laid beside him. A warhorse already slain waited nearby. And then murmurs turned toward the living. Someone would join him. Subscribe to the video sharing channel to follow each step of this haunting ritual, where death walked hand in hand with tradition, and the cost of honor was life itself. The woman stood with lowered eyes, draped in bright cloth that shimmered in the torchlight. She didn't struggle. She didn't cry. Those who knew the rites understood. She had volunteered. Or had she? Historians still debate whether this was always voluntary. Some accounts speak of honor, others of terror. The slave girl, often a captive taken during raids, was promised paradise by the priests. But at what cost? Around her, chance began. The high priestess, known only as the Angel of Death, had arrived in silence. Clad in black robes, her face painted white, she held a curved blade wrapped in cloth. Her presence turned the crowd from mourners to participants. Now the ritual was fully alive. Still, this was only the beginning. Children peeked through wooden fences. Dogs howled. Somewhere a baby cried. But above it all was the shiptall, waiting, hungry. The villagers brought wood. Not just any wood, oaken. Logs from ancient trees, split by hand and dried for weeks. The pyre would be strong enough to lift the dead beyond this world. Beside it, the chieftain's shield was painted anew, bearing the symbols of his clan, ravens, spears, and a spiral. Meant to confuse evil spirits, every item had meaning. Every act had purpose. Oddly, feathers were tucked beneath the chieftain's head. Goose, not eagle soft, white, unexpected. This, too, is recorded, perhaps to comfort the soul, or confuse death itself. As night deepened, the ship was pushed closer to shore. Torches reflected in the water like twin infernos. The tide pulled back, as if the sea itself was preparing to take its passenger. No prayers were whispered. No books were opened. This was not a quiet farewell. It was a rite of thunder and flame. A declaration. Here lies a warrior. And so the ship waited, not yet lit, not yet sent. But its time would come. Tomorrow, the fire. Tonight, the preparation. And across the fjord, in the darkness, something stirred. The next morning arrived heavy and gray. Mist draped over the village like a woolen cloak, muffling sound, pressing close. The drums had stopped, but the silence that followed was louder somehow. In that quiet, the most important choice had already been made. Someone among the living would not stay among them for long. The villagers gathered at the edge of the clearing. A small circle formed near the chieftain's resting place, where the body lay still, wrapped now in layers of cloth embroidered with symbols of thunder and sea. At his feet sat bowls of berries, roasted meat, and ale food for the journey. But next to those lay something far more unsettling. Ropes. This was not a mere goodbye. This was a passage. And tradition dictated that the honored dead should not travel alone. All eyes turned to the woman who had stood silently the night before. She was young, barely more than a girl. Her hands were stained from the preparation work, grinding herbs, scrubbing bones, anointing the body. Some called her the chieftain's concubine. Others believed she was a slave taken from the east, perhaps from the lands near Russ. Her name has not survived history, only what she did next. Two men approached her slowly. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. With surprising calm, she allowed them to lift her by the arms and guide her to a small tent beside the ship. The angel of death was already inside, waiting. What happened in that tent has never been fully known. The Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan wrote of similar rites, observing that the girl was given strong drink, opium-laced perhaps, and asked to speak with spirits. Her words were written down, sacred and bizarre. She claimed to see her dead master calling her forward, promising velvet cushions and feasting in the afterlife. Whether hallucination or belief, no one questioned it. The ritual demanded she be bathed, adorned in fine garments, then escorted 3 times around the village. At each stop, she would offer gifts to the ancestors, coins, bread, a comb, symbols of a life ending and a journey beginning. But the oddest part came at the second stop, where she was handed a hen. The hen was alive, clucking, feathers fluffed. From the morning chill, the girl held it tight, whispered something to it, then with sudden force, snapped its neck and dropped it at her feet. Historians still debate whether the hen represented fertility, sacrifice, or a way to confuse death. Some say the hen's soul distracted the darker spirits. Others say it was simply an offering. But the detail is too specific to ignore, and the act too deliberate. By midday, the procession reached the ship. Its belly had been filled with offerings, grain, sacks, fishing nets, spears, even a small harp. Each item served a purpose in the afterlife, according to Viking belief. One did not cross into eternity empty-handed. The chieftain was then lifted by 12 men, each one of them chosen not just for strength but for loyalty. As his body was laid in the center of the ship, the villagers began to chant, not words of mourning, but songs of memory. They recounted raids on the Irish coast, tales of bloodied axes, and once, a storm so fierce that it tore the sails from the mast, yet spared the crew. Amidst the chanting, the girl reappeared. She now wore a red dress. Red, in Viking funeral rites, often symbolized both blood and rebirth. Her hair had been braided tightly, threaded with silver beads. In her hand, a small blade ceremonial, not meant for defense. She stepped onto the ship, walked calmly to the chieftain's side, and sat cross-legged, facing the proud. Then, the angel of death joined her. Climbing aboard like a wraith, the priestess moved with deliberate precision. She carried no tools but a wooden club and that curved blade, still wrapped. Her voice rose raspy low, a language most didn't understand. Some say it was Old Norse, others say it was older still. And then, the ritual reached its most terrible point. No words can soften. What followed? The girl was placed on her back. The angel of death whispered to her, and she nodded once. What happened next was quick, methodical, and eerily calm. The club came down first to the chest, then the throat. The blade followed. There was no scream. Only silence, then chants again. It's here that even the hottest warriors turned their gaze. The moment was not just sacred, it was unbearable. The ship rocked slightly. The sea lapped against its hull, hungry and patient. Within minutes, the girl's body was placed beside the chieftain. Her hands folded over her stomach, her eyes closed. In death, she became part of his legend, part of his passage. Was it noble? Was it cruel? Historians still debate the meaning of these rites. Some call it devotion. Others call it spectacle. But none deny the power of the act, the way it bound the living and the dead together. Under one flame. As the sun began to lower, the fire was prepared. Children were sent away. The elderly stood at a distance, lips moving in soft prayers or ancient rhymes, and still the ship waited. Not yet, not quite. But soon. In the shadows, the angel of death stepped off the ship. Her work was done. Smoke drifted from the kindling stacks, trailing upward like whispered promises. At last, the time had come. The ship, now burdened with two bodies, the weight of memory, and the scent of pine resin, rocked gently on the tide. The villagers formed a semicircle along the rocky shore, each holding a torch. Their faces glowed orange in the deepening dusk. The signal came with a single horn blast, long, low, mournful. One by one, the torches were lowered to the wood piled beneath the vessel, where dried branches had been soaked in oils. Fire caught fast, licking eagerly up the sides, crawling toward the deck with greedy fingers. This was no simple pyre. The flames didn't just consume, they transformed. They danced around the chieftain's war helmet, reflected in the silver studs of his boots, hissed against the soaked cloth draped over his armor. Beside him, the girl's red dress curled inward as the heat took hold. No cries rang out. The silence of the crowd was complete. Not from fear, but reverence. Fire was the bridge between worlds. Oddly enough, the ship wasn't pushed out to sea, not yet. Contrary to popular myth, most Viking ships used in cremation stayed near shore, either beached or tethered. Only in rare cases, especially for nobles, was the entire ship floated and set ablaze on open waters. This was one such occasion. Oars jutted from the sides like the legs of a spider. The vessel, wrapped in flame, was slowly nudged seaward by poles and ropes. Once the current took it, the sea began to swallow the distance, pulling the burning ship into the gloom. Some in the crowd began to chant again, not words, but low humming tones. The vibration of sound met the rhythm of waves. It created an odd harmony. It was as if the earth itself had joined the ritual. A dog barked once in the background. A woman shushed a crying child. But most stood still, rooted like trees. No one dared look away. The heat from the fire was intense, yet no one stepped back. Tears welled in the corners of many eyes, not from grief, but smoke, or maybe both. One elder dropped to his knees, not from exhaustion, but duty. He picked up a handful of ash from a previous ritual site, crushed it in his palm, and whispered the name of the chieftain. A strange custom, but an old one. Some believed it connected souls across generations. Others believed it cursed them. Historians still debate how often these full-scale ship burnings occurred. Archaeological evidence suggests they were rare, reserved for the most powerful. The cost alone was immense. A longship was not cheap. It was a marvel of engineering, often taking a full season to build. To burn it, fully intact, was a statement that life had ended, but legend had begun. And what of the smell? Not often discussed, but important. The scent of burning pine, oak, linen, flesh. It would cling to the village for days. It signaled to everyone, near and far, that a chieftain had died. The smoke itself became a message sent skyward. Children were taught not to fear it. Elders taught them to breathe it in, to remember that this cycle would one day include them. Not all would go in fire. Some would go into barrows, others into the sea itself. But none would be forgotten. Suddenly, a gust of wind shifted the ship's path. The flames surged higher, catching the mast, which snapped in a burst of sparks. The villagers gasped, but no one moved. Interference was forbidden. Whatever happened now belonged to the gods. And then, the most unexpected sound. Laughter. Soft, strange, almost buried under the crackle. A boy, no older than 10, giggled at the sight of sparks dancing like fireflies. His mother hushed him, but not unkindly. Even in death, life flickered. The ship drifted farther. Soon, it would be no more than an ember on the waves. A red glow swallowed by the horizon, but before it vanished, something peculiar happened. A raven appeared overhead, gliding silently across the smoke. One villager pointed. Another crossed their chest in the old way. The raven circled once, twice, then veered inland. Some saw it as a sign. Odin, perhaps, watching his warrior return. Some scoffed. Birds were common. Yet the timing. Lingered in memory long after the fire died. And as the ship slipped from view, the villagers began to turn away. No one clapped. No one spoke. They simply returned to their homes, one by one, carrying with them the weight of what they had witnessed. A burning ship, a sacrificed girl, a legacy sealed in fire. The beach was empty again. Ashes floated on the fair surface of the sea. Not all would sink. Some would drift back to shore. Children would find them the next morning, blackened pieces of wood, half-burnt coins, perhaps even a cracked helm. To the young, they were treasure. To the elders, relics. To the dead, echoes, The ritual was complete. The fire had spoken. The past had been honored, the gods satisfied for now. Ash clung to the waves like scattered memories. In the morning, the shore bore no sign of the flames that had towered the night before, only charred splinters, faint black smudges on the rocks, and the silence that follows something sacred. But within the village, the rituals were not yet done. Now began the after Reichsdays, marked by feasting, storytelling, and remembrance. To an outsider, the scene might appear joyful. Tables were filled with roasted lamb, pickled fish, bread. Darkened by rye, horns of mead passed from hand to hand. Children laughed. Men slapped backs. But behind every smile lay the weight of the fire, the girl, the flames rising skyward. Feasting after a funeral was more than custom. It was belief. The dead needed joy to journey well, laughter to light their path. Mourning without celebration was thought to trap the soul. And so, in the smoky longhouse, they drank not to forget, but to remember in full. Amid the celebration stood a skald, a poet, with a harp strung tight as a war bow. He struck a few solemn chords, then began to sing, not a song of sorrow, but one of valor. He sang of the chieftain's last raid down the Frankish coast, of gold plundered and foes humbled, of a battle fought knee-deep in mud and blood. Embellished, certainly, believed. Entirely. Stories like these kept the dead alive. At the edge of the room, an old woman whispered over a pot of herbs, sprinkling dried birch leaves into the fire. The scent changed bitter, sharp, cleansing. Some said it helped send the spirit forward. Others said it kept darker things at bay. An odd detail was the appearance of carved wooden masks, dozens of them, painted with wild eyes and bared teeth, hung above the hearth. Some villagers wore them as they danced. The purpose? Historians still debate whether they were meant to frighten off evil spirits or impersonate gods in disguise. Either way, they gave the celebration a surreal, almost theatrical air. Somewhere, in the haze of smoke and song, someone knocked over a jug of ale. Laughter followed. A man shouted something in jest, and a woman tossed a crust of bread at his head. It was strange how quickly joy could return after death. But that, too, was part of the rite. At midnight, the final toast was raised. One man stood, a grizzled warrior with silver hair and an eye clouded by age. He raised his horn and spoke the chieftain's name 3 times. The crowd echoed him. Then, in complete silence, they drank. Nothing else was said. The next day, the cleanup began. But first, the grave needed sealing. Not all of the chieftain's remains had burned. Despite the roaring flames, fragments of bone and bits of iron survived, collected in solemn silence. These would be placed in a burial mound, a rounded hill of earth and stone, constructed over several days by dozens of hands. Mounds like these still dot the Scandinavian countryside. Some are small, mere humps in the grass. Others are massive, towering monuments to lives long past. The chieftain's mound would be somewhere between not royal, but not forgotten. The location was chosen carefully. On a slope, overlooking the water, where the sea breeze could always touch it. Inside the mound, the bones were laid in a shallow stone-lined pit. Around them, tokens were arranged: charred weapon hilts, melted jewelry, even a small wooden figure of Thor with a hammer raised high. Then the earth was shoveled back in, one layer at a time. No headstone, no marker. Only the memory carried in song and ash. And then came the strangest part. A wolf pelt was draped over the top of the mound. No one spoke of its meaning directly, but every villager watched with quiet reverence. Some whispered it was meant to guard the grave. Others claimed the chieftain had once slain a monstrous wolf during a storm. Maybe both were true. When the pelt was in place, the crowd stepped back. 3 times a horn was blown, once for the body, once for the soul, once for the journey. After that, no one visited the mound for 9 days. It was taboo. Interruption might call the soul back before it had fully crossed. Oddly enough, on the 7th day, a boat washed ashore. Small, broken, clearly unmanned. The villagers said nothing, but a few elders nodded slowly. Signs like this were not unusual. Whether driftwood or divine, they were accepted without question. Historians have long puzzled over these post-funeral customs. There is evidence that some Viking funerals included mock battles days after the burial, warriors staging symbolic duels, reenacting moments from the deceased's life. Was this performance, tribute, magic? Perhaps all 3. In this village, though, things remained quiet. There was no battle, no duel, only the rising sun, the cry of gulls, and the memory of a girl in a red dress. She had no mound, no stone. But, in hushed tones, mothers told their daughters about her, the one who went willingly, or not. The feasting ended. The hearth was swept clean, and though the smell of smoke lingered in the beams for days, life resumed. The fishermen returned to their boats. Children resumed their games. But something had shifted. The village had witnessed a passage, the kind that marks time in the bones. And somewhere beneath the waves, in the last remnants of that burning ship, 2 spirits drifted, bound in ritual, memory, and flame. The longship was gone. No sail, no mast, no bones of the vessel left to find. But the story of its burning, of the man who sailed it in death and the girl who followed, had already begun to spread. In the weeks that followed, messengers and traders passed through, carrying whispers of the ritual to neighboring settlements. Some scoffed. Others nodded in knowing silence. Everyone had heard of such funerals, but few had seen one. And then came the woodworkers. They arrived from the forest paths, men and women with thick hands and quiet steps. Their task was to begin the next part of the ritual, building a new ship. Not to sail, but to bury. Unlike the flaming longship, this one would never touch water. It would be constructed in a shallow pit, covered over with earth and stone. A ship grave. Such burials were rare. Only a handful survive today. Oseberg, Gokstad, and others scattered beneath Norwegian soil. Archaeological treasures unearthed centuries later, packed with goods, tools, textiles, and secrets. But this ship too would be a monument, not to the man, but to the legacy. And that legacy was not simple. While the new ship took shape, the village elders gathered. They debated in hushed tones over whether the sacrifice had been too public, whether the angel of death had lingered too long, whether something had followed the flames home. Strange things had started to happen. A herd of goats refused to cross a certain stream. A girl woke screaming, claiming she saw a woman with red braids outside her window. One boy, pale and shivering, insisted he had found a burnt comb in the reeds, just like the one given to the girl before her death. Superstition? Perhaps, But the village grew cautious. Salt was sprinkled across thresholds. Carvings of Thor and Freyr were fixed to doorframes. Even the fiercest warriors wore iron rings on strings beneath their tunics' charms to ward off wandering spirits. Still, the work on the burial ship continued. Each plank was shaped with care, curved to mimic the real thing. Nails were blessed before they were driven into the hull when objects of significance, a spear with a hollow shaft, believed to have been gifted by a god, a necklace of amber beads, a cauldron etched with waves. Most curious of all, a spool of thread with 3 strands twisted together. Historians still debate the meaning of this item. Some believe it represents the Norse fates, who wove the destinies of gods and men. Others argue it was simply a household item misinterpreted by time. But the presence of the thread is too specific, too deliberate, to dismiss. As the ship neared completion, a decision was made. No body would be placed inside. This would be a symbolic burial. An empty tomb. A vessel not for the dead, but for remembrance. On the 9th day, the ship was lowered into the ground. Earth was packed around it, carefully shaped into a low mound. No stone marked the spot, only a ring of standing poles, each carved with different animals: boar, bear, raven, and snake. The symbolism was layered. The boar for courage, the bear for strength, the raven for wisdom and war, and the snake for transformation. At dusk, the angel of death returned. Her appearance sent ripples through the village. She had not been seen since the funeral, and some believed she had left forever. But there she stood, black-robed, face unpainted, eyes unreadable. She walked once around the mound, clockwise, then placed a single feather white, curled at its base. Then she left. No one stopped her. That night, the villagers gathered again. No drums this time, no feasting. Just quiet talk, bread passed between neighbors, and stories told beneath wool blankets. One tale stood out. An old man claimed that, years earlier, during a sea voyage near Iceland, he had seen a burning ship far off the coast. It sailed against the wind, he said. It made no sound, but in its fire he saw faces, men, women, even a horse. And at the front, a girl in red. Was it a memory? A lie, or something more? The children leaned in, wide-eyed. The elders didn't argue. In Viking culture, memory mattered more than fact. To be remembered was to live again. To be spoken of was to walk once more among the living. And so, around that low fire, the chieftain and the girl lived again. Not in flesh, but in words. Their ship sailed forever in story. And somewhere, far beyond the fjords and fields, it's said that those who die with honor wake again in golden halls, with swords in hand, laughter on their lips, and the smoke of their funeral fires trailing behind them like cloaks of glory. The wind howled gently across the mound. The feather remained. The burial mound stood undisturbed for seasons. Grass took root over the curved soil. Birds nested in the carved wooden poles. Children, warned to stay away, still dared one another to touch the base and run. Most never made it past the Raven post. But even as the physical sight faded into the landscape, the story grew. Travelers brought it beyond the fjords, reshaping it with each telling. In one village, the girl was a princess. In another, a sorceress. Some versions said the fire wouldn't start until her name was spoken. Others claimed the ship screamed as it burned. Legends have a way of bending truth into something sharper. Meanwhile, not all Viking funerals blazed across the sea. In the vast northern lands, where trees were scarce and the ground froze hard by early autumn, other rites emerged quieter, but no less profound. Burial under mounds became the norm for many. Whole ships, stripped of sails and oars, were dragged inland and lowered into pits. Bodies were laid inside with goods, animals, and occasionally a slave or two. Over them, earth was piled, stone added for weight. These ships would never sail, but they symbolized the journey all the same. In one such burial, near what is now Norway, archaeologists found a horse with its legs broken and folded, placed beside its dead rider. It was not killed by age or disease. It was part of the rite, a companion in death, a grim farewell. Oddly enough, in some graves, seeds have been found carefully placed inside clay pots or sewn into clothing. Not just herbs or healing plants, but flax, barley, even apple pits. Offerings, perhaps, or the hope of nourishment in the next world. Historians still debate whether these were symbolic acts of life after death or simple agricultural traditions carried into burial. But the intention feels clear. Something should grow after loss. In the eastern reaches of the Viking world, near the rivers of Russ, funeral customs grew more elaborate. Traders, chieftains, and warlords were often buried in ships built directly into raised hills, sometimes with rooms inside, almost like small homes. One excavation revealed a bed, complete with pillows and furs. On a nearby table lay a comb, a knife, a game board with missing pieces. Next to the body jewelry from the east, coins from Baghdad, and a goblet carved from walrus ivory. These weren't just funerals. They were statements. Messages to the living and the dead. A reminder. This person mattered. In another site, the grave goods included musical instruments, wooden flutes, bone whistles, even a harp with snapped strings. A detail both odd and touching. Did the dead enjoy music? Or were the instruments left as gifts for the gods? A curious find came from Denmark, a burial mound with two bodies. One warrior, one woman. They were not side by side but layered. The woman had been buried months after the man, placed directly above him, their heads aligned. Some believe she died of grief. Others suspect ritual. No flame touched their remains, only time. But even within these soil-bound graves, traces of fire still appeared. Charred wood, ash scattered near the head, as if to ensure that some part of the ritual flame endured. Back in the fjord village, the memory of the burning ship held firm. The angel of death was never seen again, though rumors placed her in distant ports, guiding other souls, speaking to spirits, vanishing like smoke. But one odd occurrence kept tongues wagging for years. During a harsh winter, when snow buried the mounds and ice locked the streams, a shepherd stumbled across something in the woods. A featherwhite curled frozen to a tree trunk. Nothing unusual, except it was embedded in the bark. Not resting, not caught. Embedded. He told no one for a week. Then, over drinks, he shared the tale. Some laughed, some frowned. One elder simply stood, left the room, and never spoke of it. The feather was never found again, but stories about it multiplied. They said the girl's spirit still walked in red calm, unblinking, watching those who disrespected the rites. They said her presence protected the village from plague or storms or madness. They said she was both blessing and warning, a symbol, a flame. Not all Viking funerals were grand. Many were small, simple burials in shallow graves, covered in stones, forgotten within a generation, but some burned so brightly that they were never extinguished. They live in poems, in songs, in the way firelight flickers across a drinking hall, in the way a raven circles just once before flying inland, and always in the way the sea smells after something has burned upon it. Not every Viking was sent to sea in flame, and not every grave was filled with gold. But across the wide expanse of the Norse world, one truth echoed from shore to shore: death demanded ritual. Even the humblest villager received rites often, echoing the grand gestures of kings, though smaller in scale and silence. In a fishing hamlet pressed against cliffs and tide, a man died during a storm. He wasn't a warrior nor chieftain, just an oarmaker, one of dozens who carved life into the wooden ribs of ships. But to his neighbors he was vital. His death called for respect. A shallow pit was dug near the trees, not the sea. The ground was wet, the sky unforgiving. Instead of a ship, they buried a model handmaid, no longer than a child's arm. Inside the wooden toy lay his tools, his favorite pipe, and a single raven feather. This wasn't just custom. It was belief. The Vikings held tightly to the idea of balance. What was done in life echoed in death. To bury a carpenter with no wood was like sending a warrior without a sword. Some families, unable to afford full rituals, buried their dead with symbols, miniature hammers for Thor's blessing, stones with carved runes for safe passage, or scraps of cloth soaked in animal fat and burned alongside the body, giving a small taste of the cremation fires reserved for greater souls. Yet, even in these quiet burials, strange customs appeared. One such oddity was the placement of iron scissors under the pillow of the dead, not for grooming, for protection. Against what? That remains a mystery. Historians still debate whether these were meant to ward off revenant spirits, believed to rise from the grave if not properly honored. And then there was the graveyard. In parts of Scandinavia, a thread was tied around the toe of the corpse, and the other end wrapped around a stick planted in the ground. This was called the dead man's tether. Its meaning? Unclear. Some say it symbolized the soul's slow release. Others say it held the spirit in place until all rites were complete. But it wasn't just the dead who were affected by the ritual. The living, too, were transformed. Those who prepared the bodies washed them, wrapped them, wept over them, were considered ritually unclean for a time. They could not hunt. They could not eat meat. Some wore ash on their faces for days. Others shaved their heads. One old tale tells of a widow who refused to eat until her husband's spirit visited her in a dream. He did so, the story goes, riding a white elk, telling her to plant barley and never to speak his name again. She followed his words. The barley grew taller than any in the village. His name faded from lips. But the story remained. The treatment of children in death reveals another layer of Viking belief. Tiny graves, often without goods, have been found near longhouses and by rivers. Sometimes a toy boat or small knife would be tucked in with the bones. In one case, a single animal tooth was laid in the child's hand. The symbolism of these objects is unclear, but the gesture is universal. Protection, remembrance, perhaps love. Some believed children's souls traveled faster than adults. Others feared they wandered, unfinished, restless. Certain graves show signs of heavy stone placed atop them, perhaps to hold the spirit down, or to mark the loss as unbearable. And among the most haunting graves are those with no clear identity, skeletons, buried with mixed symbols, Christian crosses and pagan hammers, Latin coins beside Norse idols. These transitional graves mark a time of great change, when the old gods made room for a new one. In such graves, confusion meets reverence. The family may not have known which path to follow, so they followed both. Back in the fjord village, the memory of the fire-sent chieftain and the sacrificed girl still stirred. But time had a way of softening even the brightest flames. One day, years after the funeral, a child wandered into the woods and found a blackened coin in the dirt silver, melted on one side, shaped like a serpent. No one claimed it. The coin was placed on a windowsill, and over time it disappeared. Some said the girl took it back. Others said the coin had finished its journey. In modern times, archaeologists uncovered evidence of these very stories. A ring of stones beneath a farmhouse with charred remains beneath. A miniature ship buried with a sword far too large for its grave. Runes etched on bones, some reversed, as if written for the dead to read from below. And those centuries have passed, the essence remains. The Vikings didn't just bury their dead. They sent them off with ritual, with fire, with stories. Each death, a ripple in the water. Each funeral, a reminder. And every now and then, when the northern lights streak green and gold across the sky, some still say it's the shield maidens, riding to meet the newly fallen. Their ships ablaze, their spirits unbound, their names whispered in smoke. The sea, for the Vikings, was not merely a path to conquest, it was a highway to the afterlife. And though the flaming ship captures the imagination, it wasn't the only way to send the dead on their final voyage. In a coastal village far from the fjord fires, a different kind of funeral unfolded. A chieftain had died in winter. The earth was too frozen to dig. Wood was too precious to burn, but he could not be left unburied. So the villagers turned to another tradition: burial at sea. Wrapped in thick layers of wool and fur, the body was secured inside a smaller boat. Stones were placed at the feet, coins on the eyes. His sword, broken in half, laid across his chest, a common ritual believed to kill the weapon, so it could join its master. At dawn, the villagers rowed the vessel beyond the breakwaters. There, with only gulls watching, they lowered the boat into the icy water. The chieftain sank slowly, swallowed by the dark, salt-heavy sea. No fire, no chant, only silence, and a single splash. Not all Viking funerals sought spectacle. Sometimes the most powerful moments were the quietest. But even here, odd customs revealed themselves. Before the burial, a villager had smeared the dead man's hands with fish oil, not perfume, not herbs. Fish oil. Historians still debate the reason. Was it to attract sea creatures, ensuring the body would not drift ashore? Or was it symbolic, returning the chieftain to the sea, his true domain? Such gestures, though strange, were meaningful. Another unusual tradition involved the destruction of property. After a death, some families intentionally damaged the deceased's possessions, cracking shields, snapping arrows, burning household objects. This wasn't carelessness. It was release. The belief was that only dead objects could accompany the soul to the other side. Once, in a rural grave, archaeologists found a comb broken into 3 precise pieces, laid in a line, as if counting something, or leaving a message. Nearby, a pile of sheep bones, all left legs, no other parts. The purpose? No one knows. Even stranger, one burial uncovered a man placed face down with a large stone under his chin. This was not a mistake. It was deliberate. Some believe he was a criminal, denied the dignity of a warrior's rest. Others argue it was to prevent him from returning, a spirit restrained by stone and shame. Sometimes the land itself dictated funeral style. In Iceland, volcanic rock and lava fields made large mounds difficult. There, the dead were often buried in natural fissures, cracks in the earth that led who knew where. Some believed these were openings to Helheim, the Norse underworld. A shortcut, perhaps, or a punishment. But even in these grim graves, signs of care emerged: clay cups, wool blankets, and in one case, a polished amber bead tucked into the palm. A small kindness. One recurring theme in Viking funerals is the layering of belief. Christianity, creeping in from the south, began to alter the rites. Crosses appeared beside hammers. Prayers were whispered alongside chants to Odin. Some burials featured no goods at all, just a body, wrapped tight, facing east, toward Jerusalem. These were the converts. Yet, even they could not quite let go of old ways. A bishop's grave in Norway once revealed a cross in his hand and a raven engraved beneath his feet, conflicting symbols. Unified purpose. As the two faiths merged, funeral practices became more nuanced. Fire was frowned upon. Sacrifice was banned. But memory remained. In villages straddling both worlds, a compromise emerged: a shallow grave for the body and a small, ceremonial boat buried nearby, sometimes only a few feet long, with no real function except to honor tradition, like a ghost ship made of dirt and prayer. One such grave, unearthed in recent years, featured no body at all. Just weapons, jewelry, tools, laid out in the shape of a person. An empty funeral. Perhaps the body was lost at sea, or never found. Perhaps the person had no family, only friends who remembered. Whatever the reason, they were given something. A shape, a presence. A place. In the old fjord village, stories of the burning ship continued to echo. Now, years later, a stone stood where the fire had once blazed. No inscription. Just a smooth, flat surface, blackened at the center, as if scorched. From within, some said it had always been there. Others said it grew from the earth. Children avoided it. Elders nodded to it. And every year, on the day of the funeral, someone left a feather, always white, always curled. The rituals had changed, but the respect had not. The Vikings may have vanished into history's long shadow, but their funerals, those strange, beautiful, terrifying ceremonies, remained like footprints in the fog, proof of love. Of fear, of belief. And above all, of a people who knew how to say goodbye, even when they suspected it wasn't forever. Snow fell gently across the fjord, covering the burial mounds in a blanket of white. The old ship-shaped grave, long since swallowed by grass and moss, now looked like a soft hill, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the story buried beneath it. But for those who did, this was sacred ground. Each snowflake felt like a whispered dot in the quiet of winter. Death felt closer. It was during these long nights that another funeral rite often took place, the ancestral calling. A ceremony not to bury the dead, but to speak with them. In a dim longhouse, lit only by embers and fat-burning lamps, villagers would gather, the air thick with smoke and silence. An elder, usually a woman, would sit in the center, eyes closed, hands resting on a carved staff. Around her, others would chant or hum low notes meant to lull the spirit world closer. They weren't conjuring ghosts. They were listening for memory. In these moments, names were spoken aloud, those who had died in the past year, and those lost long before. Stories would follow. A boy recalling his grandfather's laugh. A woman recounting the taste of her mother's bread. A warrior reciting his brother's final words before a raid. Even here, the Vikings made ritual of remembrance, but strange details crept into these nights. In one tale from the Eastern Isles, a man claimed that after chanting his father's name, the flames in the hearth shifted blue and stayed that way for hours. In another, a child who had never met her grandmother suddenly began speaking in her dialect, telling stories she couldn't have known. Historians still debate the cultural purpose of these ancestor nights. Were they spiritual events, early forms of therapy, or simply a structured way to keep lineage alive? The consensus is no consensus, but the practice itself is real, documented in sagas and oral histories alike. These vigils often ended with a curious gesture, the passing of the salt horn, a drinking horn filled not with ale, but with seawater, and salt passed hand to hand. Each person would dip their fingers in, touch it to their lips, and whisper a wish or vow. Odd, yes, but the symbolism was rich. Salt preserved, salt purified, and salt, like the sea, carried memory. After the horn completed its circle, it was poured into the hearth, fire hissing as it tasted the sea. Another forgotten custom, the death shoes. Found in a handful of burials. These soft leather shoes were tied to the feet of the deceased, even when the rest of the clothing had rotted away. The shoes were stitched from one piece of hide, no seams believed, to ease travel in the afterlife. Some were stuffed with herbs, thyme, angelica, or mugwort. One grave revealed a shoe containing a tiny bone carving of a fish no bigger than a thumbnail. Theories vary. Was the fish meant to guide the soul to sea, or serve as food in the next world? Either way, the presence of shoes implies motion, as if death were not a place, but a road. And where there's a road, there's a journey. Back in the village, the snow thickened. The stone with the scorched center now wore a white cap, hiding its age. But a boy, maybe 10 winters old, had wandered there on a dare. He brought no offerings, no stories, only curiosity. As he approached, a wind picked up. He stopped. Not from fear, from instinct. Because in the hush between snowfall and silence, he thought he heard something, not words, not whispers. Footsteps. Soft, measured, fading. He turned. Nothing behind him, nothing ahead, only the stone, and the feather at its base, half buried in snow. He didn't speak of it, but the next day he carved a tiny boat out of driftwood, tied a string around its mast, and hung it from a tree overlooking the sea. No one asked why. Sometimes gestures say enough. In the centuries that followed, these quiet funerals, these whispered rites, left little behind. Wood decays, stones crumble, Names are forgotten, but the rituals echo. In other ways, in the hush before a eulogy, in the silence after a fire dies, in the feeling hard to explain that someone, somewhere, is watching the sea, waiting to be remembered. Because the Vikings believed that death was not the end, it was a crossing. And the living? The living were the ones who lit the fires. By the time spring returned to the fjords, the snow had receded, and green crept back across the burial mounds. Birds sang again, boats returned to the waters, and life pushed forward. Yet the funerals of old left marks deeper than weather or time. They shaped the land, the people, and the beliefs that came after. In one region, far to the north where the sea met the sky in misty silence, archaeologists uncovered an unusually large burial, a double-decked ship grave. The lower layer held the body of a woman, richly adorned with silk, imported beads, and a curved blade. Above her, separated by timber planks, another woman rested. This one wore simpler garb, yet held a staff with a carved serpent at its tip. Scene was no accident. This was believed to be the burial of a Valva Osiris, or spiritual guide. In Norse culture, she was the one who spoke to the gods, read fate, and performed the darkest rites. But here's what makes this grave strange. It wasn't burned. Not a single char mark. No ash, no scorched earth. Just careful construction. And layers of meaning. The staff, when tested, was found to contain traces of medicinal herbs, some known to cause visions. Perhaps this was her tool in life. And beyond, historians still debate whether this was a true spiritual burial or a symbolic performance. Was the second woman a student, a servant, a fellow seer? Whatever the truth, the presence of two women in one ship, buried without fire, hinted at a rare rite in afterlife, union of wisdom and remembrance. Odd burials like these suggest a spiritual fluidity among the Vikings. While some were burned to ash, others were entombed in soil or lowered into rivers. Some were placed in trees, yes, trees. One rare discovery revealed human bones tucked into the hollow trunk of an old oak. No coffin, no markings, just a skull and a handful of beads. A mistake or something deeper? In Viking cosmology, trees were sacred. Yggdrasil, the world tree, connected all realms. Perhaps this burial was an attempt to merge body and myth, to grow into legend literally. The mystery deepens with tales of sky burials. Though rarely practiced in Viking territories, a few stories tell of bodies left on mountain tops, wrapped in furs, left to the birds. These may have been criminals or saints. The logic: let nature take the body. Let the soul escape untouched by flame or soil. But most disturbing of all was the ritual of grave reopening. Yes, some Viking graves were intentionally dug up weeks, months, or even years after the burial. Why? Several reasons. In one case, it appeared the family had removed a sword. Maybe they needed it. Or perhaps they believed it had not served its master in death. In another, a skeleton showed signs of post-mortem damage. A missing head, removed rib bones, and crushed pelvis. Not by looters, by design. Historians still debate the reasons. One theory suggests fear of drug-run dead spirits known to rise if not properly bound. By dismantling the body, the villagers may have been preventing a return. Another theory: politics. If a chieftain died and a rival later rose to power, Digging up the grave could have been a symbolic act, an erasure. A statement, a claim, the living rewriting the past. And then, curiously, there were graves within graves, layered burials where one body had been buried decades earlier and another added on top without disturbing the first. Family members, lovers, coincidence? The practice is rare, but it appears to have been deliberate. The older grave always remains intact. The newer body is placed gently above, sometimes with a small carving of two intertwined animals, usually wolves or serpents. The symbolism? Unity, shared destiny. A companionship that even death could not separate. Back in the fjord village, time had weathered the stone, but the rituals lived on in smaller ways. Every spring, villagers left coins near the old fire rock, not many, just enough to clink. No names, no ceremony. Just the gesture. One year, a foreign traveler asked about the tradition. The answer was simple: for those who left too soon. The traveler nodded and left a coin of their own, not Viking, not Norse, but understood. And so the funerals of the Vikings, those fierce, quiet, strange farewells, began to transcend their own world. Not just history, not just myth, but inheritance, because death, after all, is the one rite every culture must perform. Some light fires, some dig deep. The Vikings did both. And when their stories are told, the flames flicker again, not on the sea, but in the mind. High on a wind-scoured hill above the fjords, where only moss dared grow and ravens kept their secrets. Another funeral story unfolded, this one written not in saga, but in stone. A burial chamber carved deep into the granite had recently come to light, not a grave mound, not a ship. A cave. Its entrance was low, hidden by centuries of lichen and silence. Inside, archaeologists found bones, at least 5 individuals, their skeletons scattered but not disordered. Tools lay in the corners: a hammer, a whetstone, broken arrowheads. But the most unusual item was a single whale's tooth, polished smooth, placed carefully on a flat rock at the center of the chamber. This wasn't a tomb. It was a gathering. Historians still debate whether this was a family burial, a secret, cult site, or a refuge for the dying. The whale tooth complicates everything. The Vikings respected the sea, but they didn't typically venerate whales. So why such an object? Some scholars argue the cave was a sacred space for souls who died far from home, lost at sea, perished during raids, or simply forgotten. Their bones were brought back, not to a public fire, but to a quiet place, a return of sorts, elsewhere. In the Norse world, cairns, piles of stones, were often erected along travel paths. Not graves, but markers. Many were built at mountain passes or dangerous crossings. Some even held bits of bone, scraps of cloth, or coins tucked beneath their base. Travelers added to them as they passed, tossing stones as both offering and prayer. These cairns, though small, became symbols of shared memory. Not for one person, but for all who journeyed and never returned. Among the stranger funeral traces discovered was a ritual involving mirrors. A few burial sites contained shards of glass or polished metal placed near the head or eyes. Vikings didn't commonly use mirrors, especially not in burial. So why were they there? One theory suggests they were portals, tools to help the soul see the next world or reflect away evil spirits. Another idea proposes the mirrors were meant to confuse the dead, to prevent them from finding their way back. Odd, eerie, and completely in line with the Viking view of death as a journey. And a risk. Because in Norse belief, not all spirits stayed gone. The fear of Draugr the undead was real and widespread. Tales told of restless warriors returning to guard treasure, punish betrayal, or simply because they weren't sent off properly. To prevent this, some bodies were buried with peculiar precautions, iron nails driven through their heels, heavy stones on their chests, or in extreme cases, the head removed and placed between the legs. Not violence, protection, insurance. Strange as it sounds, even today, some grave sites show signs of such anti-return measures. Whether they worked, no one can say. The sea still holds its secrets. The final funeral in the village came on the heels of a brutal winter. An elder woman, long respected as a healer and storyteller, had passed in her sleep. There was no ship, no sacrifice, just her body wrapped in fur, laid in a simple cart and pulled to the edge of a bluff. There, as dusk crept in, the villagers gathered. No words were spoken. Only a long, low note hummed by every throat present, deep, resonant, carried by the wind. Before burial, her closest friend placed a book in her hands, not a real one, just wooden tablets bound with thread, painted with runes and blank pages. The symbol of all the stories she told, now untold. And into the earth she went. Beside her, a carved wooden spoon, a dried fish, and a black stone smooth as water. It wasn't grandeur, but it was sacred. Funerals in the Viking world weren't always about status. They were about symbols, about memory, about making sure those who mattered in life would matter still in death. Modern rituals echo these old ones in subtle ways. The lighting of candles, the placing of shoes by a door, a song sung even when no one is sure why. They're echoes, reminders that once, long ago, someone lit a ship on fire. Because goodbye wasn't enough. And perhaps it still isn't. Far beyond the mountains of Norway, in lands touched by Viking expansion, but shaped by their own rhythms, Viking funerals took on new forms, half borrowed, half born anew. Along the rivers of the east, in the territories of the Russ, Viking traders and warriors carried their customs inland, blending them with Slavic, Turkic, and even Persian traditions. One of the most vivid accounts of a Viking funeral in these distant lands comes not from saga, but from a foreign observer, an Arab diplomat visiting the city of the Russ. What he described was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. A chieftain had died, and for 10 days his body lay on display, richly adorned and perfumed daily with incense. Slaves and concubines served food to guests, but one young slave girl was marked to follow him into death. She knew it. She volunteered. This ritual sacrifice wasn't just accepted, it was formalized. For 10 days, she was given food, wine, and attention. She sang, she danced. She said her goodbyes. And then came the ship. It was docked at the riverbank. Not to sail, but to burn. Inside, they placed the chieftain's body, weapons, a dog, 2 horses, and offerings of bread and fruit. The girl was lifted into the ship, where she visited each man of the tribe one final time, part of a custom believed to transfer life, energy, perhaps even status, from the living to the dead. At last, she was laid beside the chieftain, and an elder woman called the Angel of Death carried out the rite. The ship was set ablaze. Smoke poured over the river. Flames climbed high. And when the fire finally died, all that remained was ash and bone. This practice, known from a single historical account, is both rare and controversial. Some scholars believe it was ceremonial theater. Others say it reflected real beliefs about loyalty, rebirth, and power. Historians still debate whether such practices were common, or whether this was a unique blend of Viking and Slavic customs adapted for the region. Either way, it is a stark reminder of how far Viking rituals could travel, and how they could shift and adapt to the world around them. Back in Scandinavia, a subtler custom developed among the coastal peoples, the tide burial, when bodies were too disfigured, too decomposed, or simply unrecoverable. Families would gather at low tide, offering clothes, carved tokens, or empty coffins to the sea. These objects were carried out as the tide rose, vanishing into the waves. One carved oar was found washed up years later on a distant shore, inscribed with runes that read, "Row him home." Such ceremonies lacked fire or blood, but they held. A weight just as deep in a burial mound near Sweden. A bizarre discovery was made: a full horse skeleton buried atop a man with no saddle, no bridle. Just a man beneath a beast. Why? Theories range from mythological symbolism, perhaps the horse was Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged steed, to practical belief. The horse would carry the soul to the next world. But the oddest detail? The horse had shoes, not iron ones. Soft leather, stitched with thread and lined with moss. Funeral shoes. For a horse, whether this was ritual kindness or deeply spiritual logic, it speaks to how richly symbolic Viking funerals became. And then there were the stones. Across Scandinavia, runnestones still stand, towering slabs etched with the names of the dead, the deeds of the living, and symbols of journeys across sea and sky. Some stones stand alone. Others form circles, gates, or paths. One such path, discovered recently in Gotland, led from a longhouse to a cliff's edge. Each stone bore the name of an ancestor, and the final stone blank. Waiting. Perhaps for the next name. Perhaps for none. And now, back in the fjord village, the world had turned again. Children born after the fire didn't know the chieftain's name or the girl in red. But they still tossed coins by the stone. They still found feathers tucked in. Fences caught on reeds, drifting across paths where no birds flew. Legends had replaced memory. But the ritual remained, because what the Vikings truly buried wasn't just the dead. It was meaning, wrapped in wood, flame, feather, and stone, left for time to scatter, and for stories like this one to gather again. The silence of the grave was never the end in the Viking world. For a people who believed in multiple realms, Asgard, Midgard, Helheim, death was a transition, not a finish line. And their funerals, however dramatic or discreet, were designed to reflect that ongoing journey. One lesser-known rite came from the inland forests of central Sweden. Here, where rivers twisted like silver veins through pine and stone, a seasonal ritual known as the year wake took place. Every spring, relatives of the recently deceased would return to the burial site, not to mourn, but to feast. Blankets were laid across the mounds. Bread, meat, and beer were passed among the living, and a portion set aside for the dead. These were not ghostly suppers. They were affirmations of connection. At dusk, Songs were sung not dirges, but stories. One family's tradition was to shout the name of their ancestor into the wind 3 times, believing that if the name echoed back, the soul was at peace. Strange? Maybe, but death, to the Vikings, was full of these edges blending myth, gesture, and symbolism. In one mound, archaeologists found not just offerings or tools, but a metal rattle like a child's toy, crafted with care. It held small stones inside and made a soft clink when shaken. Not for a child, but for a warrior. Was it a charm? A reminder of laughter? A relic from a long-lost child now reunited in death? Historians still debate its meaning. Some say it warded off evil. Others believe it was used during a pre-burial dance. One theory suggests it symbolized time, each shake a tick of eternity. Another oddity emerged from the island of Gland, where several graves included fox bones, carefully cleaned and placed near the feet of the dead. Not eaten, not skinned, just present. The fox, in Norse folklore, was a trickster, a shapeshifter. Was it a guide for the soul or a guardian against deceit in the afterlife? The fox's purpose remains unclear, but its placement suggests care, not accident. These quiet, sometimes confounding details are what truly shape Viking funerals. Not just the grand fires or the sacrificial rites, but the intimate gestures, born of deep belief and cultural nuance. One beautiful custom recorded in oral tradition was the making of funeral wind chimes, crafted from bone, shell, and copper. These delicate instruments were hung from trees near the grave. As the wind moved through them, they whispered music to the dead. In some villages, it was believed that if the chimes stopped moving, the spirit had left for good. Few physical examples remain. Time and weather have erased most. But in a remote valley in Norway, remnants of copper wire and drilled bone fragments were found in a tree's hollow, wind chime roots. Songs now silent. Meanwhile, back in the fjord village, the last elder who remembered the burning ship funeral was nearing his own end. He'd told the tale countless times, how the girl in red stood calm, how the fire rose too fast, how the angel of death whispered a name no one else heard. He didn't fear death, but he made a curious request. No ship, no fire. He asked to be buried with a fishing hook in his hand and a net of seaweed tied across his chest. He called it his line to the other side. His children honored the wish, and 3 weeks later, a gull flew inland and sat atop his grave for 3 days. It never cried. It never left. On the 4th day, it vanished. No one mentioned it aloud, but someone carved a bird into the gravestone. Just a line drawing. Simple, stark. Symbol enough. The Vikings left behind a world rich in burial culture, shaped not just by war, but by water, wind, wood, and wonder. Their funerals weren't only endings, they were doorways. And the rituals they performed, the ones they carried across mountains and seas, the ones they whispered over bones, were attempts to make peace with the greatest mystery of all. What happens next? In the twilight hours of Viking history, as Christianity spread across the north and the old gods dimmed in the public eye, the funeral customs of the Norse began to change, not all at once, but piece by piece. Grand cremations gave way to burials. In churchyards, sacrifices faded. Fire was replaced with prayer. But even under the watchful eye of the cross, the bones of ancient ritual remained. A grave in western Norway, dated to the early 11th century, illustrates this shift in vivid contrast. A woman, buried facing east in Christian fashion, wore a modest cross around her neck. But beneath her folded hands, archaeologists found a Thor's hammer carved from whalebone hidden inside her sleeve. A quiet rebellion. Or just someone unwilling to choose between gods? Historians still debate whether this was defiance or dual belief. But either way, her body carried both the old world and the new. The transition period left behind many such contradictions in one grave. A man was buried with no weapons, Christian influence. But beside him, someone had placed a bowl of honey and a lock of hair, items common in pagan funerals, linked to sweetness in the afterlife and bonds to the living. The syncretism, as scholars call it, made funerals personal and unpredictable. A bishop buried with runes, a pagan warlord entombed near a church, and one grave still mysterious, found to contain no body at all, only a helmet, a spear, and a carved wooden bird with a missing eye. Odin, or a final message? Meanwhile, the burning ship ritual, long outlawed, still flickered in secret stories. In some coastal villages, fishermen told tales of ghost sails seen at sunset, phantom ships of flame, drifting along the horizon, vanishing as quickly as they came. One story told of a family who, upon losing their eldest son to the sea, built a boat from driftwood and seaweed, set it alight, and pushed it out into the fjord at dusk. No one spoke during the rite. No one dared. The boat returned blackened, empty. No one ever touched it. It remained on shore for years, slowly falling apart with each tide, until one day it was gone. Whether real or fable, such tales spoke to an enduring truth. The funeral was never just about death. It was about letting go, and sometimes letting go meant doing something that no longer fit within law or doctrine, but still felt right. Even the church, over time, adapted in some Christian Viking burials. Small ships were carved into the headstones, or their graves arranged in boat-like shapes using stone markers. The symbolism endured. Reshaped. One grave, found in Denmark, featured a wooden staff laid along the spine of the dead, man inscribed with Latin prayers and Viking runes, protection from both ends of eternity. And in another, a child was buried with a wooden toy horse and a small silver cross, each placed in opposite hands. Love doesn't choose sides. The old fjord village, now quiet, held fewer of the stories than before. The fire rock had grown moss. The feathers fewer now. But some gestures remained. A bundle of twigs, tied with red thread, left in the roots of a tree. A feather, waxed and oiled, left at the base of a dry well. These weren't museum displays. They were memories, passed down not through writing, but through rhythm, through hands that carved, through fingers that rapped, through voices that hummed lullabies older than any book. Some Viking funeral traditions had vanished. Others had merely gone underground. In one tale, a widow whose husband died in a Christian town secretly burned his hunting cloak in a cave, believing the smoke would carry his scent to the gods. No one saw her do it. But the next day, when she returned, a raven sat at the entrance, watching, and it did not fly away. So she left a bone, wrapped in leather, at its feet. Because some stories don't need to be told aloud. They just need to be done. The Vikings did not fear death. Not entirely. They feared being forgotten, unmourned, left adrift with no fire, no feather, no name, and so they built their funerals as bridges between life and death, myth and memory, sea and sky. Some still burn in the mind like fire, others whisper like wind through stone. But all of them, each rite, each ritual were made to be felt and remembered. The final breath of Viking funerals did not vanish in flame or sink beneath cold waters. It lingered in old stories, in moss-covered ruins, in the very shape of northern landscapes. Because to the Vikings, death was a passage, and funerals? They were the map. In the last centuries of their age, as cities replaced villages and laws replaced lore, funerals became quieter. But that didn't mean they lost their meaning. If anything, the final Viking burials carried more weight, the burden of memory in a world that was forgetting. One of the last known Viking ship burials, found in Norway beneath layers of farmland, tells a story not of spectacle, but of stubborn belief. The ship was small, buried rather than burned. Inside lay two women, one dressed richly in silk and silver, the other more modestly, but holding a hammer of Thor and a staff carved in the likeness of Yggdrasil. The symmetry was striking. Two women, two faiths, two worlds. Historians still debate whether they were priestesses, leaders, lovers, or something else entirely. But what's clear is this: the old ways had not died. They had simply gone quiet, curling themselves beneath the soil, waiting. Another strange sight, uncovered in eastern Sweden, held a man buried upright. Yes, standing. No grave goods, no stones, just a narrow pit and his bones, arranged as if he had been planted like a tree. Why would anyone be buried this way? Some theorize he was a watchman meant to stand eternal guard. Others believe it was punishment meant to deny him rest. Yet another theory: the community feared his return. Standing, he'd be easier to spot. In death, as in life, Vikings were rarely laid to rest without a purpose. There's also the curious case of the Whisper Mound. In northern Iceland, one burial mound was built with a small tunnel carved into its side, not large enough to crawl into, but deep enough to speak into. Local lore claimed that during storms you could hear voices in the tunnel, not echoes. Responses. People would leave messages, confessions, even lullabies. The tunnel was eventually sealed not by time, but by order of a 13th century bishop. But for years, villagers still gathered at the mound on winter nights, just to listen. And now, centuries later, the legacy of Viking funerals doesn't just live in archaeology. It lives in rituals we still perform without knowing their source. Lighting a candle by the bed of the dying, scattering ashes over the sea, playing tokens with the body. These echoes are not coincidence. Their inheritance. In the old fjord village, the fire rock remained, barely visible under creeping ivy and soft soil. But once a year, as the sky turned orange with late summer dusk, someone always came. They left a carving, a tiny ship, a bird, a pair of shoes. No ceremony, no name, just the act, and the silence that followed. Because at their core, Viking funerals were not about endings. They were about connection. To the earth, the sky, the gods. To family, to love, to memory. And to the idea that somewhere, beyond the sea or the snow or the stars, someone waits with an oar and a light, that the journey is not over, that the fire has not gone out, only moved on. The Viking funeral was never a single ceremony. It was a constellation of rituals, gestures, and beliefs threaded across time and place. From flaming ships and solemn mounds to whispered prayers and symbolic trinkets, every act of parting reflected a culture that refused to let death feel final. Across Scandinavia and beyond, the dead were sent off with fire, feathers, fox bones, and fish oil. Ships carried them not just across water, but between worlds. Graves shaped like boats, chimes hung in trees, and salt horns passed hand to hand. Each gesture carved a path through the unknown. The rituals evolved. Christianity changed the language, but not always the heart. Even when Thor's hammer lay beside the cross, the message was the same. Remember me. Some funerals dazzled with spectacle. Others whispered through moss. But all were built with meaning. Whether it was a girl dressed in red walking into fire, or a child's toy placed carefully in the palm of the dead, nothing was random. Even today, Viking funeral echoes still stir the modern world. We light candles. We gather. We grieve in ceremony. Because, like them, we seek to hold on to something in the face of loss, something sacred. The Vikings burned ships not just to honor the dead, but to light the way forward. And in the stories we tell, in the rituals we inherit, their fire still flickers. Sleep now, warrior. The sea is calm. The oars are resting. The boat is waiting.